Prime Minister Trudeau and the Liberal government are looking for a way to find an excuse to go to an election.
Obviously, Mr. Speaker, we don't want an election. Canadians don't want an election, but Canadians need to know that their parliament continues to work constructively.
Mr. Trudeau would prefer to try and go to an election rather than ask questions about insider spending scandals.
Nobody on the side of the government that wanted an election. I didn't want an election.
Well, that snap election was averted for now. The federal government survived its latest confidence vote, this time over a Conservative motion to create a special committee to look into the government's ethics and pandemic spending. So how did this political showdown play out? Where does this minority parliament go next? I'm here with At Issue for a special Wednesday edition. Chantal Hébert, Andrew Coyne, Althea Raj, all with me tonight. Okay, it does feel like the closest we've come yet to a snap election. I was certainly a little anxious through the day. Andrew, what did you make of how this ultimately played out?
I think it was a fairly brutal and over-the-top power play by the Liberals. We cannot have the situation where every time Parliament wants to investigate allegations of government wrongdoing, that the government simply threatens to dissolve Parliament. The arguments that were put forward that somehow that the government would be unable to function, that'd be paralyzed because a committee of Parliament was asking ministers questions, is just too preposterous to give any time to. It is an appalling precedent. They did so. I don't think they were necessarily anxious to have an election, but they were certainly more willing to risk an election, marginally more so than the Conservatives and much more so than the NDP, as we saw, so that when it came down to the negotiations, the NDP simply caved. But it's, obviously the government of the day has the power to declare whatever it likes to be a confidence vote. But there's some expectation that it's not going to abuse that. And I would say this comes under the category of abuse. You can't simply just declare that any time Parliament wants to investigate something, that's going to be in and of itself a confidence motion. That leaves nothing for Parliament to do.
But did the Conservatives overreach in any way around defining the parameters of that committee? I'll put that to Chantal.
Yes, they were basically asking for a shoot fish in a barrel kind of mandate, which would have allowed them to just decide that this, that, and that were ethical breaches. I think up to a point, the overreach became obvious when they said that they would have liked to hear Justin Trudeau's chief of staff's husband, Rob Silver, over alleged improper lobbying when the ethics commissioner declined to actually look into the case, said there was no case there. I think the Liberals did two things in this process, which tactically puts them on top. The first was to say, well, not necessarily an election, but we're ready to go in an election, and that line will remain a line going forward. So who gets to run the House of Commons when the government is a minority? And the second one is Justin Trudeau has now put forward a narrative thread that he will use, I believe, to go to the Governor General if the House again becomes mostly consumed with the We Charity issue.
Well, Althea, how, at the end of the day, how did you make of how it played out? What did you make of it?
At the end of the day, every party did what was right for them in terms of politics and to their partisan advantage. The Conservatives were hoping, and if you ask Conservative MPs, many MPs will admit that the motion was over the top, or as some said, too cute by half, was an overreach. It was dripping with partisanship, and I'm going to inject some gray here to Andrew's point. It is a little bit paralyzing when you're asking public servants to prepare their ministers to testify before committee, and you're basically saying the minister could be hauled every day for like 3 hours to testify. There's only so many public servants engaged on this topic. And so, yes, at some point it does get a little onerous. But so the Conservatives did what they thought was in their interest. The Liberals are fully prepared to go in a campaign, and frankly, it is in their advantage politically to go now. If they wait until the spring, they will have tax season is upon us, where everybody who got their CERB now finds out they need to pay tax on it. There's the $1 trillion debt. There's the ethics commissioner's report on the whole we stuff. I mean, there's a lot of mess coming in 2021. The NDP has never had a sweeter deal. Why would they want to pull the plug on this parliament? And the Bloc Québécois is looking at polling like we saw today in Léger, looking and saying, hey, we've got partisan advantage. We could go now and we might actually come out on top. So everybody basically acted in their own interest.
What was it just me, Andrew, or was there really a possibility of an election here? Or is the NDP too stuck in a corner to actually follow through with it, do you think?
They're at 13% in the polls. I think the last poll I saw, they've been bleeding support to the Liberals. They are lacking funds. Jagmeet Singh did better than expected in the last election, but he remains, I don't think, particularly an asset for the party. I don't think they want an election anytime soon. Look, there's no doubt that there were partisan motives on all sides here, and I agree that the resolution might have been better negotiated with the other opposition parties or something that had broader support. But I don't think we should treat this as just another bit of partisan games playing like you would over a tax bill or a spending bill. Whether or not the government of the day is using public funds to benefit its friends and people who hire its family is a deadly serious matter. There are laws about this kind of thing. And Parliament has to be able to get to the bottom of that. And the context of this is not just this special committee, but the blockading and filibustering of the existing committees after the prorogation of Parliament. You know, remember the Prime Minister said, when Parliament comes back, they'll be able to ask any questions they like. Well, they couldn't. The withholding or the excessive redacting of documents, et cetera. There are real questions here about whether Parliament can actually get to the bottom of this matter. The government has been running out the clock on this, and at some point, the question of the efficacy of Parliament becomes into play.
Okay, Chantal wants in. Yep.
Up to a point, but at the end of the day, there are other mechanisms on these issues to hold the government accountable, and I suspect that for many voters, whatever the ethics commissioner is going to have to say on the we issue, for instance, is going to weigh a lot more heavily than anything that happens in a committee. And on this, I lead you back to the Senate scandal and the committees that had the opposition trying to get answers, or the sponsorship scandal. The real answers did not ultimately ever come from parliamentary committees. And why that is because partisanship and exaggeration usually takes over from facts and reality. And so far, I've seen no evidence that it's very different in this case.
Althea?
Well, the special committee that the Conservatives proposed was so extensive. 15 members, most of them opposition MPs, a Conservative chair, the mandate to go look into Liberal spending to Liberal-friendly firms, to look at, as Chantal mentioned, Katie Telford, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's chief of staff's husband's alleged improper lobbying, to look further into the we stuff, to ask for more documents. It's obvious why the Liberals wanted to shut that down. That being said, the NDP, in voting with the Liberals today, still said that they plan to bring in those 3 points back to the Ethics Committee, where there is an opposition chair, and try to drill down on those topics in that committee. But we have seen the Liberals filibuster. But I do think that at some point, though, I mean, the public knows something stinks when Liberal MPs prevent anybody from coming forward or any investigation from being heard. So I do think that there is possibility that whatever the opposition wants to find out, there are other mechanisms aside from this one special committee.
Is this, and I'm almost out of time, but Andrew, is this not the way minority parliaments work? They bring us to the brink and pull back and find ways out of it, or is this something different?
As I say, it is not uncommon practice for a government to declare that, a budget, for example, obviously is a conference vote, and it's not dirty pool for it to say some other thing that it regarded as being integral to its agenda was a conference vote. I'm not at all clear that creating a committee to look into something should be created as a conference vote. And to me, it calls into question whether the government should in fact have the unilateral power to declare something that is or is not a conference vote. If it's going to abuse that power, then I think that has to be looked at.
30 seconds, Chantal, what do you think?
And I'm guessing I have to go back to basics, which is when a government does that, it is basically saying it will face voters after having done that.
Okay, so no federal election call for now, but New Brunswick did have an election last month. Saskatchewan and BC going to the polls in the coming days. So let's talk about the politics around elections during a pandemic, the risks and benefits for anyone. There's also a couple by-elections coming as well. I'll start with you on this, Althea. It does seem like, in New Brunswick, it worked out for the Premier, for Premier Higgs. He took a risk and then got a majority. Is this a risk that premiers and other politicians should be willing to take?
Oh, well, I don't want to tell them what they should do, but it is a risk that seems to be paying off, right? People want stable leadership during the pandemic, and what we saw in New Brunswick obviously worked in Lincoln's favor with 5 extra seats. Polls suggest that John Horgan is on his way to a majority government as well, and so it must be very tempting if you're in a minority situation, thinking that it's not too onerous to campaign during a pandemic. I mean, even federally, from what the parties have told me, their plans are you're campaigning on the cheap. You don't have media following you around. You'd be dealing with local media or whatever foreign media wants, or foreign national media wants to follow you around at their own cost. It's a battle of the airways. Social media will be important, so the NDP may not be as penalized. I'm talking federally here. So I think that it is very attractive, shall we say, to go now when people are craving stable leadership.
I can see that argument, but I can also see, Andrew, that voters think it's entirely too opportunistic, not to mention risky behavior for public health.
It's the sort of thing that can backfire you, or any kind of early election can backfire on you. Sure. For example, David Peterson, people thought that he was being rather too opportunistic when he called his election back in, 1990? In this case, there's a tendency for people to rally around whoever's in power in a crisis. Mm-hmm. Whether they deserve that support is another matter. I don't think any government can be said to have particularly well handled. Maybe BC is arguable, but I don't think you can really argue that governments have particularly well handled this crisis. I think they were generally caught flat-footed by it. But there is that tendency. I think the other factor in play is how serious the pandemic is. When New Brunswick went to the polls, maybe arguably when BC went to the polls, that the numbers of cases were, still relatively low. They've been coming up rather rapidly since then. If that trend continues, then a government that tried to do it a week, a month, 2 months, 3 months from now might find public opinion wasn't quite so forgiving if people really thought that this was taking their eye off the ball, or indeed putting people's health at risk.
I should say that Saskatchewan's in an election, but it was a planned election, so it's a little bit different. Yeah. But they find themselves in the election, and the premier there likely will, if polls are to be believed, win again as well. So there is also maybe just something to, as Andrew was saying, stability and not wanting change at a time like this, Chantal, because we're dealing with enough change.
Well, if you're looking just at the approval ratings of the Premier in Quebec, where things have not been going well, a poll today showed 50% support for the incumbent, the CAQ government. If you look at what happened to Premier Ford in Ontario's approval rating, which was dismally low before this started and is now really high, of course, people rally to the notion of stability at a time when what they mostly crave is a return to normality. I'm not even sure that most voters are willing to punish governments, and I include in this the federal government for holding an election, in the sense that it kind of provides them a sense of normality. And there is only so many hours you can spend looking at those pandemic numbers. And no one believes that a premier or a party leader on the campaign trail would save them from the pandemic if only he or she were not campaigning. So, yes, it's an old trick. Remember Stephen Harper's strong, stable government coming out of the 2008 global financial crisis. Jean Charest in the middle of it in 2008 saying, I need 2 hands on the wheel, so give me a majority. It works. It has worked in lesser crises, so there should be no surprise that people do buy the stability argument in this particular unprecedented crisis.
Well, I was trying to make this about provinces, but now you've got me thinking again about what happened here in Ottawa today, because it does seem like the opportunity is almost too good to turn away from in some ways. I don't know, Althea, whether you would agree with that federally.
Well, I mean, personally, I think there were two things that were very visible on Wednesday. One, Erin O'Toole looked relieved that there was not going to be an election as soon as Jagmeet Singh came out and said he was going to vote, or that he was going to not support the Liberals' plan to have an election. And then Pablo Rodriguez, the government House leader, came out after the vote, and he looked actually disappointed that there wasn't going to be an election. He said, of course, that he didn't want an election, but sometimes it's hard. Your face betrays you, and it seemed like Pablo Rodriguez was a little bit disappointed that maybe that opportunity was missed. I think there are definitely people within the Liberal Party who really wanted to have an election at this moment, and they are looking at the calendar and thinking that there won't be a good time until possibly next fall, or even, well, in another 3 years.
Yeah.
Be careful what you wish for, though. Horgan was up, I think, 19 points when he called the election. The Liberals are up 6. Maybe that translates into a majority. Maybe they can run the campaign in a way that they increase their support, but I certainly wouldn't take it for granted.
Last word to you, Chantal, then I got to go.
It would be a competitive federal election, but if you're a Liberal strategist and you're looking at the calendar, you're probably thinking it's easier to go now when people still need you than to go in 6, 8, 12 months when they're facing the reality of all the damage left by the pandemic.
Okay, on that rather depressing note, I'll let you all go. Thank you very much. I'll talk to you next week.